Trustee Farrar, will you please convene the Committee on University and Faculty Personnel?
Thank you, Chair Day. Will the Committee on University and Faculty Personnel please come to order? We will now hear public comment from those who signed up to address agenda items coming before the committee today. There are 2 requests for public comment. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to address the board. As your name is called, please come to the microphone. Our first speaker is Rocky Sanchez, VP for Representation, CSUEU.
Good morning, Chancellor White, trustees, campus presidents, brothers and sisters. Rocky Sanchez, VP for Representation, CSUEU. I'm addressing the committee today because I noticed that they have the campus presidents' salaries, market equity, all of that kind of good stuff for the presidents. I understand, like Tessie said, they have families to feed, just like we do. You're very good about doing equity for your top managers, just like you're very good at inflating how many managers you have. I hope when you come to the table that you look at us in the same light and show us the same respect.
And our next and final speaker will be Tessie Rees, Chair Bargaining Unit 2, CSUEU.
Good morning. Rocky just stole everything I was just going to say. But I will just add that we are all employees. And the same thing, your employees do have a problem with stagnant wages, just as the presidents do, just as a lack of marketing. In particular, you have several classifications that you brought to the table last time to show how low and how behind the market many of our own classifications in CSUEU are. So I hope that in 2020, next year, that we will have another robust conversation about just how far behind the market that our classifications are and how we are going to address them and fix them together. Thank you.
Thank you both for your comments. It is now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Are there any objections to the approval of the consent agenda? Seeing none, hearing none too, the consent agenda is approved. The committee has one item on today's discussion agenda. Item 2 is an information item regarding executive compensation study policy implications. This item will be presented by Chancellor White and Evelyn Nazario, Vice Chancellor for Human Resources, followed by Saul DeFonso from Simpson Consulting. Chancellor White, could you please begin?
Thank you, Trustee Farrar. Today, we again take up the topic of executive compensation. You will recall from our July 2018 meeting, you were presented with data indicating that the base pay of CSU campus presidents lagged significantly behind that of established peer market comparators. At that time, this board requested that the analysis be expanded to include a comparison of total remuneration. That expanded study will be presented shortly. But first, I would like to take a moment to put the issue into broader context and to underscore why it is so important that we address this matter now. Our executive compensation practices can be traced back to the Great Recession when presidential salaries were frozen. New presidents were hired at the salary level of their predecessors or below, despite trustee policy which permitted up to a 10% incremental increase. As the economy and our budgets have recovered and stabilized, restrictions have eased somewhat. For example, our campus leaders have received annual salary increases in line with those of management personnel, but at levels less than our bargain units employees. However, the underlying policy related to executive compensation has never been updated. It remains rooted in historic conditions more than 10 years past. And as a result, and as you'll see momentarily, our campus leaders' compensation has fallen well behind that of their peer market comparators, in most cases at least 15% below the middle point, the median of the market. However, one might still reasonably ask, why do we need to re-examine our executive comp policy? After all, just look at the quality of the campus leaders gathered in this chamber today. This group of presidents is extraordinarily high performing. Our leaders represent the demographics and life experiences of the campuses they lead and the communities that they serve better than ever before in the history of this university. Every campus across the system benefits from the dynamic diversity of our leadership. And that is precisely why we need a reasonable, consistent, and competitive compensation policy. Let me explain a little bit. We have been able to recruit and hire leaders of this caliber because we have been able to attract broad and diverse candidate pools and then take the painstaking efforts to ensure that those candidates who best match the needs of the particular campus and community and who meet the performance standards of this board rise to the top. But as we continue to lag behind our market competitors in terms of compensation, our candidate pools will be limited. Although it has not yet impacted the quality of our current leadership, we have increasingly seen candidates withdraw themselves from consideration or not explore the opportunity in the first place as a result of our compensation levels. And this trend will continue to grow if we do not take action. Our outstanding campus presidents choose and stay with the CSU for a whole host of reasons, and remuneration is but one of them. But we have lost talented leaders from time to time, and we must acknowledge that compensation is an important factor in their leaving. It is an important factor in us retaining the best of the best. Campus leadership positions continue to grow in complexity and importance, requiring expertise in so many areas: educational policy, public safety, community relations, mental and physical health care, the provision of basic needs, fundraising, and the list goes on. And it won't be getting shorter anytime soon. Campus presidents, I know from experience, and I know from our campus presidents' behaviors, are never off the clock. They are executives who manage complex organizations, thousands of employees, and budgets that average $370 million across the system. When you consider the sheer magnitude and importance of the role of a CSU president to our students, our faculty, our staff, our extended campus communities, and ultimately to the state of California and the country, it is imperative that we continue to recruit and retain great human talent. To do so, we must re-examine our executive comp practices, which were born, as I said, in the recession. It's time to take steps toward implementing a reasonable, consistent, competitive policy that has clear and transparent benchmarks for setting and adjusting presidential compensation. Vice Chancellor Nazario, would you please introduce the presentation?
Thank you, Chancellor White. I'd like to introduce Sal DeFonso and David Coe from Simpson Consulting, who will be presenting today. Simpson Consulting is a national leader in executive compensation matters with expertise and experience in the higher education sector. Sal?
Thank you, Evelyn, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the board. My name is Sal DeFonso, and I'm a vice president at Simpson Consulting. Joining me today is my colleague, David Coe. We will be presenting information today pertaining to executive compensation. Today's agenda will include some background information, presentation of the data, and a closing summary with observations and policy implications. As you may remember, we were engaged by CSU last year to review executive salaries. We presented data to you at the July board meeting, comparing the base pay of CSU campus presidents with established peer comparators. You asked that we continue our review, expanding it to include total executive remuneration. Total remuneration in this analysis includes base pay, incentives, retirement and other deferred compensation, taxable benefits such as auto allowance, and non-taxable benefits such as health insurance. Total remuneration reflects the total compensation package being received by an executive. The purpose of today's presentation is to provide the board with information pertaining to total presidential remuneration and how CSU's campus presidents benchmark against comparators. This analysis compares CSU to the median or the 50th percentile of the defined market. The industry standard for market competitiveness is 15% above and below the median. And a quick definition of median. The median is the middle of the data point. So if you had 11 data points, it would be the sixth one, the one that's right in the middle. And the reason we do that is that we don't want to take an average and have an extreme data point pull the average either up or down. So that's why we use the median. The point I wish to emphasize is that the range from 15% below to 15% above the middle, the median, is the competitive range in our defined markets. 15% below the median is a critical number because it represents the entry point of a competitive range. And most of your presidents are lower than that entry point, even after many years of service. For groups A and B, the lag to market becomes even larger when you analyze total remuneration, as we will present here today. For Group C campuses, total remuneration analysis results in a minor improvement relative to market. CSU campuses are grouped based upon enrollment size and total operating expenses, including research. Group A is reflective of high enrollment, mid-range research CSU campuses. Group B represents mid-enrollment, mid-range research. And lastly, Group C represents the lower enrollment, lower range research. The comparators used for each group were established in 2011 by the special committee, appointed by the board, and those will be referred to as peer comparators throughout today's presentation. As part of the study, we reviewed the current comparators to determine validity, and after a thorough review, we have determined that they would remain valid and appropriate. Simpson developed a custom survey that was sent out to the 20 established peer institutions. We didn't receive responses to the custom survey from all peer institutions. Therefore, we submitted requests for data under the Public Records Act. We also supplemented with data from the Chronicle for Higher Education, as well as previous CSU surveys. Once all data was received or obtained and was compiled, it was aged to a common date of 7/1 of 2018. Data that was more current was not aged. According to World at Work, aging data is the practice of increasing survey data by a percentage assumed to be representative of wage movements to bring the data to a consistent point in time. We use the industry standard aging factor for 2019 of 2.7% for salaries and 8% for non-taxable benefits. Please note that CSU increased the salaries of presidents on July 1st, 2019. Although salaries were not updated in our models, this does not impact the results as the comparator salaries are also as of July 2018. In instances where we had data from less than 3 comparators, that is, data was not supplied or available through any other sources, we noted it within the data set as those would be considered insufficient for statistical purposes. Additionally, housing data is not included in the total remuneration calculations because the true value of living in housing provided to peer incumbents is not easily quantifiable in a consistent manner, especially when considering the varying locations and cost of living. Data varies widely. However, it is industry standard for institutions to provide either a housing allowance or a home for the president to live in due to the work a university president is required to do, such as hosting events for fundraising and other campus community events. CSU follows this model, although for those with housing allowances, the amount hasn't increased in 14 years despite large increases in housing costs. Okay, let's dive into the data. We'll start with base salaries, somewhat a review of July 2018, but with some current data. As you can see, we have 8 comparator peer institutions for Group A, and the median base salary for the comparators is $483,757. Again, the median being the middle data point. In this slide, and others to follow, the individual comparators are plotted in green, along with a solid line to reflect the median, and dotted lines reflecting 15% below and above the median. CSU presidents are plotted in red. CSU Group A's median is $367,124, compared to the peer group median, or middle of the market, $483,757. This shows that the median for CSU presidents in Group A is more than $100,000 less than the median for their peers at comparable institutions, and places them at 24% below the peer group median. There is one president in Group A considered to be at market. We have 7 comparators for Group B. The peer group median and base salary for this group is $462,150. CSU's median for Group B base salaries is $337,497. Once again, the peer group median at $462,150 is more than $100,000 greater. CSU Group B campuses are 27% below the median for their peer group. There is one president in Group B within the competitive range. Turning to Group C, there are 5 peer comparators for this group, and the median for the comparators is $359,450. CSU Group C's median is $305,821. This group compares more favorably than Groups A and B, but remains below their peer group median by $53,629. There are 4 presidents in Group C within the minus 15% to positive 15% competitive range, and 3 are further below. And now let's look at total remuneration, which consists of base salary, incentives, retirement and deferred compensation, other taxable benefits, and non-taxable benefits for our analysis. When incorporating all aspects of compensation, the peer group median, or middle of the market for Group A, is $715,709. CSU's median of $466,649 is almost $250,000 below the peer group median, coming in 35% below the peer median. The peer group median for Group B in total remuneration is $631,456. CSU's Group B median is $452,267, a little over $175,000 less than the peer group median. This places CSU at 28% below the peer group median. The peer group median for Group C in total remuneration is $486,519. CSU's Group C median is $419,177. There is not quite as large of a gap here in Group C compared to Groups A and B, but there is still a lag to market. There are 4 presidents considered to be at market with regard to total remuneration in Group C, and 3 presidents that are more than 15% below the market median. Let us summarize them. We'd like to call out some of our observations. Base salaries for presidents in Group A and B are more than 15% below the median, which you recall is the minimum of the competitive range. And while Group C is more competitive as a group, 3 presidents are below the competitive range. Once incentives are factored in, Groups A and B lag even further behind their peer institutions. Overall, for total executive remuneration within CSU, it is our observation that while there are 6 presidents who are being compensated competitively as compared to their peers at comparable institutions, there are others, especially within Groups A and B, that warrant further review and adjustment. An additional observation is that CSU's non-cash offerings, retirement and deferred compensation, taxable benefits and non-taxable benefits, are competitive as compared to peer institutions, although it is not enough to close the overall gap in total remuneration. As CSU continues to hire new presidents post-PEPRA, the California Public Employees Pension Reform Act of 2013, of which CSU currently has 6, it should be noted that their benefit is less competitive than those hired prior to pension reform. Under PEPRA, retirement contributions are capped at $124,180. Said another way, for Group A, the simple analysis of base salaries places them at 24% below the market median. This gap increases to 35% below the market median when total remuneration is analyzed. Remember, 15% below the median is considered the floor of a competitive range. For Group B, the competitiveness gap increases minimally from 27% below the median for salary to 28% below the median for total remuneration. And for Group C, the gap nominally narrows, moving from 15% below the median on salary alone to 13% below the median on total remuneration. So what are our thoughts regarding policy implications? We think there are several things CSU must do to be more competitive in regards to total remuneration. The first would be to commit to doing so. Second would be to augment base salaries, especially for those presidents who fall below the median by more than 15%. As mentioned earlier, this is a critical number because it represents the entry point of a competitive range. One-time increases should be implemented to increase market competitiveness. If a one-time increase cannot occur, increases may be implemented over a 3-year period. It is imperative that presidents also receive annual merit increases to keep pace with the market. Based upon the labor market index, the market moves anywhere between 3 to 5% each year. If CSU president salaries aren't adjusted annually, the CSU will find itself in the same situation in a few years, especially since the CSU annual increases are below the national average. Keeping pace with the market will ensure salaries remain competitive moving forward. Enhance the ability to compete at a national level and continue to attract top candidates from a diverse array of backgrounds. Thank you. Simpson has conducted 2 costing scenarios for CSU, which are detailed on this slide. The tables you see provide costing to bring all presidents to a competitive level of 15% below the respective market median. The first costing scenario models the financial impact of one-time adjustments for all presidents. This adjustment will bring those incumbents currently below a competitive level to 15% below the median at an estimated cost of $851,709. Following a one-time adjustment, CSU must continue to monitor the market median, continue to provide annual merit increases as the market will continue to change with time, and apply further adjustments when and where necessary. The second costing scenario is a phased approach over 3 years. This scenario assumes merit salary increases at a rate of 3% per year and an adjustment of no more than 10% per year. After accounting for market salary growth over a 3-year period, all 3 groups increase to at least 15% below the market median and thus within the competitive range. The estimated cost is $1,524,056 over 3 years. Why is it important to do this now? CSU's ability to compete nationally is declining, and the institution's pool of top candidates has begun to shrink due to lower base pay and the post-PEPRA retirement cap. Additionally, presidential pay levels should be congruent with CSU's compensation philosophy, namely to pay employees fairly and competitively in order to attract, motivate, and retain the most highly qualified individuals. CSU is strongest and most competitive when the system can attract candidates with a wide variety of backgrounds and experiences. Based on these factors, Simpson highly recommends that the board create policy and take action to exercise its fiduciary responsibility to address the long-term health of the system. According to a recent article from Inside Higher Ed, more than half of presidents, 54%, said they plan to leave their current presidency in 5 years or sooner. CSU is not immune from this demographic trend and should begin and continue to plan for the future. In addition to the base salary adjustments, we further recommend that the CSU continue to increase competitiveness levels for total remuneration by offering an optional retirement plan and incorporating a variable incentive compensation program. As the system continues to hire presidents from outside the system and are new to CalPERS, the disparity in the retirement benefit post-PEPRA will continue to be an issue. It may be impossible to completely mirror pre-PEPRA benefits, but it could certainly help narrow the gap. CSU is in the exploration phase of this option for all employees, but no plans have been finalized. Additionally, CSU currently offers incentive programs for other CSU employees, both MPPs, management personal plans, and represented. Many of the CSU's comparators also offer variable pay to advance important initiatives. and this type of performance pay is typically welcomed by high-performing employees. Introducing incentive pay would benefit the system campus through the achievement of desired goals. A challenge might be that in lean years may be difficult to sustain. For reference, CSU spent $880,000 on the bonuses for MPPs and $18,060,000 on bonuses for represented employees for meritorious performance or critical skills in the 2017-2018 fiscal year. Finally, while housing was not included in the total remuneration analysis, offering housing and the associated relocation expenses for a presidential appointment is a strategic component of presidential compensation and should be considered when assessing individual total remuneration packages and potential offers. In recent years, CSU's competitive advantage when offering relocation assistance has diminished, as this assistance has become a taxable benefit and the housing allowance provided to presidents has not kept up with the rising cost of homes in California. The amount of allowance warrants attention. In conclusion, the Board of Trustees has a rare moment in time to correct pay deficiencies and improve the national competitiveness of CSU. Consequences to postponing this action will result in less diverse and smaller candidate pools for CSU leadership positions. Costs to remedy the situation are nominal relative to the overall budget of CSU. However, the impact of maintaining and hiring the most effective and talented leaders will positively affect thousands of students, staff, and faculty while planning for the future health of the system. This concludes our presentation today. We are happy to take your questions at this time.
Thank you all for that most informative presentation. I already have a list going, and we're going to go into comments or questions from the board. I see you, Becky. Chair Day.
Thank you, Trustee Farrar, and thank you to Simpson for your report, and to Vice Chancellor Desario for you and your team's diligence in responding to the board's questions over a year ago. I think the report is fairly comprehensive, and I think it sounds like you've captured most of the questions that were raised at our last hearing. It's hard to believe that it's been over 12 months, so I know it's taken some time, and I appreciate you giving it the attention that it deserves. I think it's important in the context of this conversation to stay up front that, and I've said this, and I know every one of my colleagues has said this, when we talk about compensation, we want to have a compensation plan that's fair for all, and it starts with faculty and staff at the foundation of this institution. Faculty and staff really are the heart and soul when we're talking about educating our students and helping them achieve their goals. And it wouldn't be happening without the dedicated faculty in the classrooms and the support staff across every single campus and in the central office. So I want to thank faculty and staff. I know that the negotiations that we have with our represented units are sometimes challenging, but this board has certainly worked hard to increase compensation for all employees in all groups as best we can with the resources we're given from the state, and we will continue to do so. I also think it's important, for as long as I've been on this board, and I think Trustee Farrar is the longest serving board member. I can't speak to that service, but I think from like Trustee Eisen as an example, that wave, this most recent 7-8 years of time, the very strategic and conscious decision to, as a percentage, ensure that faculty and staff are compensated at a higher percentage than what MPPs have, and I believe we have data that reflects that. I know the dollars that are included in compensation for different classifications may be higher. Obviously, they are higher for presidents, but the percentages as salary increases, right. I think that's a good example that this board has set for our executives to receive slightly less in compensation as a percentage as compared to faculty and staff. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. And I think the numbers that you've laid out are pretty stark from my perspective, the most recent being the bonuses, which I hadn't heard of that number. I think you said $800,000 in bonuses to MPPs as compared to over $18 million for all other employees, which if I did the math right, look to Vice Chancellor Relly, I think that's 0.04%. I know the cost of total payroll in the budget, some of the numbers I've seen, cost for presidents is roughly 0.2%, whereas faculty and staff, because of the numbers of people we're talking about, is the rest of that budget, it's the other 100%. So just laying that out as a bit of background and thoughts from my perspective. I think as the chancellor laid out in his comments, I think it's important that we establish a policy as a board so that we can be clear and transparent, that we can be predictable. I think the predictability is important, not just from our perspective, and not just from the president's perspective, but from the public's perspective, so that they know what to expect and what to see, and frankly, so that we aren't constantly having to have a controversial discussion, so that we can have this conversation and have a coherent policy that makes sense for all of the right reasons that hopefully we will elaborate more so today. And then also to annually report on that so that we are being transparent, and then maintain flexibility in the event of an unforeseen situation or an emergency, whether it be especially I'm thinking of a fiscal emergency, something changes in a year or two, we obviously reserve the right to modify our policies. So overall, I think the report's very comprehensive, and I think there's a lot of, as you mentioned in the last few slides, there's a lot of other issues that are probably still to be considered and maybe even more controversial perhaps. But in my sense, the most important thing I'd like to suggest for the board to consider, and we're not making any decisions today, this is just an information item, correct, Chancellor?
Correct.
So when this does come back, I'd like to place a suggestion that while I respect and appreciate your data set and the 15% below median, in my opinion, I don't think we should be shooting for 15% below median. I think we expect talent and we expect results from our presidents, and the return on investment that we get from our presidents is so profound that the multiplier effect is huge. I believe we should be setting that target at median. And so there are obviously probably going to be various opinions on this, and I hope we can have an honest and open exchange on that. But whatever we decide, I hope we make a unified decision in the future quickly, and then lay it out so that it becomes a process that sort of drives itself, that it doesn't have to keep coming back to this board, that it's public, everyone's aware of it, the decisions have been made, and unless this board wants to make a change, that the policy is sort of self-affecting, and we don't have to have this conversation every year. But again, I would like to emphasize my personal preference to set as a target the median.
All right, thank you, Chair Day. Trustee Sabali.
Last year in the summer, I believe in July, we received your first report. And we request, I think in that report, we only looked at the salary of the presidents, and we requested more aggregated data that includes benefits and retirement incentives, etc. So this is much more comprehensive. Without questioning the conclusions, and without for a moment even questioning that our presidents are underpaid, I'm still unhappy with your presentation. We get a beautiful sheet and you've prepared a beautiful presentation, and yet you didn't adjust the base salaries of the presidents that across the board reflected a 3% increase. That happened in the beginning of July. That's an easy thing to do on a spreadsheet. I mean, it's 1.5 months later, the numbers would have been more accurate. Then I questioned why you excluded housing. You mentioned that it varies from state to state, of course, and that you cannot put a price to it. But we, the Board of Trustees, the CSU, puts a very clear fixed number on housing. We either provide housing for the presidents, or we have a housing allowance, which I believe, I might be a little bit off, but it's in the vicinity of 65,000 if it's not coastal, and 75,000 a year if it's coastal. That is very easy to add, and it is also very easy, if other states don't have such comparable figures, to add them on. And when we have the comparison to other states, I mean, the difference would shrink, right? Other than New York and maybe Chicago, real estate is nowhere as expensive as in California. And we have listed comparable institutions as Boise State and Kent State and Cleveland and so on. And clearly that skews the picture a little bit. So while I don't disagree with the conclusions, I want to submit that our presidents, given the housing allowance or the house, the university house that they are given, are not by such a big margin undercompensated. And I think it would be just clearer in the numbers and fairer if we had seen that comparison. So I wanted to bring that to the attention of the board.
All right, thank you. Next, we have trustee McGorry.
Could I comment on Trustee
Please, Chancellor.
Sebelius's point? Romy, the reason our data for the current 2019 salary for presidents wasn't increased by 3% is we couldn't do that for the comparators. So we didn't want to compare 2019 data for us against 2018 data for others. And so it's normalized for the same point in time. A year from now, we could do it, but it's always going to lag by 12 months because of the ability to get the data. We also presume and know that the comparators also went up in the summertime. Right. So our instinct is when you look at this over time is that as you point out, the conclusion is valid. The second thing on housing, your question actually answers the reason why not. Even just within the CSU, there are some who are on an allowance, and that's actually $50,000 and $60,000, not the numbers you cited. And so when you compute the value of that for that individual president while they're president, if they bought a home and the market went up, and then they sold a home when they left the presidency or continued to live in it, what is that? It's very difficult to know what that financial impact is. Whereas someone who lives in a home that is either owned by the university or the university's foundation, are not out of pocket on housing costs while they're president, but they don't have any chance of having a value when they leave the presidency. And so, and about half our folks are with a home and half are without. So it is those complications, and I could turn to Cy to talk a bit more about why, if you put in spurious information in a comparison, it ends up having a spurious impact. And I think what's really instructive here for me in thinking about their analysis is if you do the simple analysis as we presented last year and again reviewed this year, the gap's here. And you do the more complicated analysis and the gap is here. It's actually slightly bigger. So I think your point that the conclusion is valid, even with the softness of some of these analyses that are inherent in the business, is an important point. Have I said anything incorrect about housing?
I would like to respond to that. Chancellor, I do understand this 3%, and that point is well taken, that the comparators increase. However, that may have been did not go up either. And with the housing, well, I don't see it quite that way, the way you evaluated that. But ever since I started in the CSU, I've heard from presidents who are provided a university house to live in, that they cannot build equity and that they're disadvantaged because they don't own a house, and that, honestly, that's nonsense. You can always buy real estate as an investment. You can buy a rental property. If you're given a house to live in for free and you feel that you're missing out on real estate appreciation because you don't own your own home, you can always buy a rental, an investment property. So I mean that argument I feel is not valid. I mean, I'm a faculty member. I'm doing this. That's how I, augment my salary. So presidents can do that too.
Just a couple comments on the housing, if you'd like me to respond to that question. First
Please.
of all, I lost money on a California house in San Diego in the early 90s. There was a recession, and I had to sell against new housing in a townhouse development. So I'm one of those few people that lost $18,000. So, but anyway, it was said earlier that California is the fifth largest economy in the world. This is basically its own country. And I think that the comparisons with the other locations, it's not so much that the extra remuneration that the presidents receive for housing here are competing against these other locations. I think it's its own economy that those housing allowances are just barely even keeping the presidents whole, and so they're really competing against themselves in their own locales if they're in San Francisco, for example, and that's just to keep them whole against the rest of the country. So I would say that housing to housing probably wouldn't be a fair comparison because it's just really trying to keep them in place. And then for the other half that don't get the housing opportunity, perhaps they're missing on appreciation, but I would argue from firsthand experience, it doesn't always go up. So.
We're going to move on. We have Trustee McGorry and then Eisen.
It's one of the tougher issues we have to deal with, setting executive compensation in the public arena, and how do we do what's fair versus the political reality of the place we live in. My concern on this study is these comparative universities were established apparently in 2011 through a commission. It seems to me it's just a weird collection of comparative universities. I don't know how they came up with these, but it just looks strange to me. I don't know how we end up with Florida in this mix and small schools on the East Coast someplace. It seems to me our real competition is mostly in the West, and that we should be comparing public universities, state universities on the western half of the United States, and not. I just think this collection, I could not justify this comparative base. And I used to do this stuff for a living with the city, setting salaries and doing salary surveys. This is just it's a funny collection to me. Would you recommend this set as a comparative basis if you were starting from scratch?
I'm going to let David Coe answer the question in terms of the criteria used for the selection. That might help give us a better picture of how these schools were selected. With that said, after he explains the criteria that were used, I think that your comparator group for the future is always up for debate, right? But to keep consistency, we didn't change what the special committee had selected back in 2011. But David, why don't you tell us the criteria used for these different locations?
Sure, and you're absolutely right. The peer groups were in fact created back in 2011. What Simpson was asked to do was actually validate the appropriateness of each of those peers. And so what we did is actually conduct some research and pull data from IPEDS, which every institution is required to report to every year. And we pulled in data for student FTE, number of students with Pell Grants, total research expenditures, and total expenses, in addition to 6-year graduation rates. And we used those criteria to determine their the individual campuses and averages, or medians, compared to that peer group. So really the total student FTE and the total expenditures really get down to the size and complexity of those peer institutions. So when we make a comparison from median to median, if they're within a close enough range, we deem them as appropriate.
And would you use this set today?
I think it will actually depend. So if you use the same filter approach, there may be other peers that may be applicable as well. And if you wish to have a geographic kind of skew towards the West, then that's certainly something that we often see. But because the presidential search, for instance, if you're looking for a candidate, is national, we typically don't always use that West Coast bias for an institution on the West Coast, of course. So it's really where do you seek your talent from? And if it's a national market, then we would say to look at a national peer set.
Okay. My comment stays the same. I just think it's a strange set of comparisons. And I would like to see a focus more on the West, state university systems in the West, and see what we come up with. How do you treat retirement again in the total comp? Do you use the cost of the retirement, or do you put a valuation on the on the benefit itself?
Yeah, so it's a combination of what are people receiving and then what do they have, right? So you can look at it both ways. And in total remuneration then, so in order to keep things comparable for each year, we look at what the presidents are receiving versus the comparator group and what they're receiving. So in a given period of time, so in the 2018 data set, what did they receive for deferred comp or retirement versus what the peers received for that? So, yeah. So, well, the data would reflect whether they received anything or not. So just to answer the question, that's what we would be looking at in terms of the time period, what was received in 2018. So,
I think, Trustee McGuire, I think the Chancellor would like to weigh in
ahead.
on this too as well.
So I just want, Trustee McGrory and other trustees who weren't on the board many years ago, back in the day, there was CPAC was a statewide organization in the governor's domain that established 20 peers for the CSU at the state level, and the board adopted that decision. CPAC was disbanded under Governor Brown, defunded and went away in 2011. And that's when the board created a commission of trustees to look at the CPAC number and to evaluate against the board's wishes as to what are the criteria that were just alluded to be part of our comparators. And so then took a subset of that CPAC group and created the ones that are in front of you. But this was a board decision informed by the CPAC history and informed by an analysis 10 or 12 years ago. And because presidential compensation is the purview of the board, we followed the board's direction in using these comparators. And I think you looked at them and they are indeed still valid today, even though they're not the ones where you sort of think academically, gosh, I wish my campus X was just like campus Y, right, in terms of its academic prowess and so forth. That's a different type of aspirational, but from a business point of view, these are actually valid, even though they are a collection of institutions we don't normally think about from a reputational point of view, academically or athletically.
I'm just going to add real quick before we go to Trustee Eisen. We, at the time, because I've been on the board a long time, we had a representative from the board that was also on CPAC. One of the board members would also be on CPAC too as well. So it was considered the standard, and it was good. Anyway, Trustee Eisen.
Thank you. So all of you know that I'm a birder, and the most important tool a birder has is binoculars. But if you're not looking at the right thing, or if you're not focusing your binoculars, they're kind of useless. I'm very, very pleased that we have done this additional work because I think it helps us to focus on the right thing, and it helps us to focus clearly. So I'm very pleased with this report. It adds a lot to what we looked at a year ago. And when I look at it, the importance of taking the action that the Chancellor has recommended becomes just absolutely crystal clear. I think in the past, we have certainly recognized that our presidents are not paid sufficiently and are not paid fairly. But what I'm afraid we've done, and actually I take that back, what I'm afraid I've done, I'm not going to speak for my fellow trustees, is mollified ourselves a bit by telling ourselves that nonetheless we have been able, despite this compensation failure, to attract extraordinary talent. And we have low turnover. We have extraordinarily loyal and able presidents that stick with us. And taking that view is charitably wrong-headed. And it leads to further unfairness. So when I look at this report, we're asking to do almost the bare minimum here. The report does not take into account seniority. And I know that that would be complicated to do and it could cut both ways, But I looked at these presidents of our comparator universities in Group B, and they do not have anywhere near the seniority of many of our presidents in Group B. So we have an exceptional group of long-term presidents that are not going to be rewarded for their seniority under the system we're proposing. The other thing I noticed about this report is that we asked for total remuneration to help us get a better picture. It actually demonstrates an even further unfairness in our compensation. For example, in Group A, the additional remuneration adds about 28% to the base salaries of our presidents. In the comparator group, it adds 48%. So when we're asking to adjust base salary and not total remuneration, we are still not going to be closing that gap sufficiently. The other third thing about this report is that it does not include incentive pay, if I understand that correctly, one-time bonuses, things like that. And we have, I think, good reason to believe that other university presidents are doing much better in the incentive pay world than we are doing. So in those three ways, we are really asking to do the bare minimum here. And so I take Adam's suggestion that we think about something more than 15%, because that's 15% of base, not total remuneration. We're only talking about adjusting base. So I think we should take that very seriously and consider that for our the action item when we come back in November. Thank you very much.
If I can respond really quickly, within the peer data set, actually incentive pay is included within their total remuneration. Sure.
All right, we have Trustee Fagan.
First, I want to thank the administration for being very transparent on this and both the agenda and the highlights and everything. And that's what we're here to do, is let people know in advance that we're thinking of this and what it is we're thinking. This is an information item, so we're not looking at a proposal specifically yet. So what I would hope and suggest, it differs a little bit from some of my fellow trustees, that the proposal be very conservative in recognizing what could happen if we go with these numbers or even higher. These numbers are dangerous to the CSU. They really are. We're taking a big risk. This is not, we're not a private company. These are tax dollars, these are tuition dollars, and even though the hard dollar numbers, the total numbers, are a small fraction of our entire budget, we live in a political world. And I would like to hear from, from the Lieutenant Governor and Speaker, because I suspect that when looking at the numbers on this chart, there's some very, very significant increases. One proposal, and this is 15% below the median, would increase, be a one-time increase of $76,000 a year for one of the presidents. Another one would be $44,000 a year. A couple of them are $44,000. And then if you go up to the total remuneration, the total dollars on all of income, there would literally be one who is here for 51%, and the total dollars currently are $400,000. So is this proposal going to increase that income by $200,000 for that president? Another one looks like $166,000 a year at 38%. A couple of them are, and here's one for $136,000. Then even in the B group, $80,000 on the base salary, one-time increase. it's hard to, first of all, let me say that I totally agree that in the ideal world, our presidents deserve all of this and more. We have the best presidents. They're hardworking. They're successful. They're very impressive. But this isn't the ideal world. What kind of reaction are we going to get in the public view? What kind of reaction are we going to get when we go to collective bargaining with our unions who want relatively small increases, and they look at this and say, my gosh, what kind of reaction are we going to get from the legislature when we ask for these increases that we've been looking at as far as the budget proposals? And they say, well, wait a minute, this isn't so hot. So I'm really concerned that if we go down this road, the negative reaction, the editorials, the political pushback, it's going to be significant. I think there are, as Trustee McGrory has brought up, issues about the specific study, how you decide on the comparators. And there's always a suspicion that when you put some study together with maybe a hope for a result that you want, that maybe there's some effort to pick the basic information that you use at the beginning to help bring about the result you want. All those are good concerns, but I think what's the overwhelming concern is the danger and the risk to our system and to our ability to succeed in the budgets we need, and the support from the public and the support from the students who may look at a tuition increase at the same time we're doing these kinds of increases and say, is this a fair world? So when the proposal is put together for the next meeting, I would hope that it would take all these issues into account.
All right, I have next on my list is Trustee Morales.
Yeah, just for the record, I want to say that before joining this board, I had served 10 years in CPAC. I want to agree with Trustee Eisen and the Chancellor on what we should be doing with this. I was chair of compensation for some 5 years. And, as chair, I struggled with this. And I think Trustee Fagan put it well. I mean, the weight, the weight of the optics politically is heavy. And I know as I was chair, I felt that. But I think we really do need to move forward with some adjustment. And I think when we get a proposal, I think hopefully at the next meeting that we will be able to think about, about those factors that you just said, because it is taxpayers' dollars, and we are being watched, and rightly so. And I also think we should be doing as well a similar study on compensation for our faculty and personnel to see where we are in those areas. Because I think we're going to be asked by the legislature and the public about, how about compensation for those important sectors? And I think we should be able to respond with some objectivity. So anyway, I just want to say that I support going forward with some policy. I don't know what the proposal is going to be, but I think we have to at some point bite the bullet and agree and consider what the results of the study, which point to that many of our presidents are underpaid.
Can I just jump in? Sorry.
Sure.
In response to Trustee Fagan, in actually the multi-year analysis that we did for the costing scenario, and we're not necessarily saying that this will be in the proposal, but there was actually a 10% maximum cap of an increase within each of those 3 years. But also there was a 3% minimum, as we suggested, to keep pace with the market. So there is that maximum that an individual can receive per year for the base salary adjustment. It was 10% of their current salary.
So This chart is just for the 1 year? Is that what I'm
I'm
hearing?
not actually sure which chart that is, but within our presentation, actually, let me take a quick look at this. So yes, the chart that you're looking at is the 1 year adjustment.
So these are accurate for 1 year, but if it were for 3 years,
Then our costing scenario would have the 10% cap for each year.
and so on the base salary, not on the.
Correct, on
other
base
goodies.
salary. Yes.
I said, I have a list here, and we're moving along. Next, we have Trustee Taylor, and then we'll hear from the Governor.
Good morning. By the way, you're not the only person who lost money on California real estate, just for the record. I'm glad we're looking at this in terms of total remuneration. I think that's the absolute right way to go. I guess I'm a little bit confused on a couple of things. One, I just want to make sure our comparables, even though they're set in 2011 and maybe worthy of reexamination, are all public universities. There are no private universities in there.
They should be all public.
All publics.
Yes.
Great. When I was with the University of California and I got into roughly monthly arguments with one stakeholder group or another, very often they included private universities. Particularly our faculty had a group of comparables that included private universities and public universities. As you might imagine, they were underpaid compared to the privates, but they were also the most generously paid compared to the publics. In fact, I think one of the things that shocked me when I got here was how low everybody's pay is across the board compared to our other friends who are headquartered in Oakland. That's one thing that I hope over time we can correct for all employees. The housing thing, again, I'm sorry, I'm just so confused on. Does everybody get a housing allowance, regardless of whether or not they have a house on campus or not?
No.
Okay,
So
only
if you-
people who don't have an on-campus house. And it's about 50 to 60 grand.
50 inland, 60 on the coast, hasn't changed in 14 years.
Great.
And about half the campuses have campus residents and about half don't.
Yeah. Would it be wise to consider taking that housing allowance, instead of calling it housing allowance, just throw it into cash compensation?
Well, it is cash compensation and it's taxable.
And it's taxable
But
compensation.
it doesn't go against their base salary for pension benefits and things of that nature.
So therein lies the kicker. If it was included in base, it would be part of,
As long as the employee was pre-PEPRA.
as long as pre-PEPRA. And remind me again, when was PEPRA passed?
14,
2013.
13?
2013. And so how many presidents do we have who are pre-2013? Because if they're CSU employees.
Majority today, but.
A majority.
Yeah, but those who come from out of state.
Or weren't in the CSU system.
Yeah, so there
Or
were
part
some
of-
who were in the CSU system and then went to some other foreign country and then came back. So they were, maybe an employee here in the 70s or 80s or 90s.
Okay.
Others have never been in the CSU. One of the ones we just appointed in this last year falls in that category, and then so is PEPRA. And as you go forward in time, which is more part of the board's responsibility here, is we're going to have greater and greater numbers of people who are post-PEPRA.
Right. And so the retirement system, which is a generous retirement system, really doesn't benefit the employee who's only with us 5-10 years at all. I mean,
Not at all, literally, but yes, it's
but
minimal.
but there's nothing special vis-a-vis some other defined benefit plan.
Agreed.
All right, thank you.
All right, we have Trustee Kounalakis. Governor.
Thank you. So I've really benefited from hearing from the other trustees about their questions and concerns about the methodology of the study. I share a lot of those questions and concerns. And to me, where this all points me, particularly Trustee Fagan, to your question about how this looks, where it points me is that rather than necessarily looking at a blanket policy, we should actually be looking at the presidential compensation on a case-by-case basis, because there's a lot of variability already. And also, frankly, because there will be different information coming at us in the future as we have turnover as to whether or not the compensation package does hinder our ability to hire somebody really great. So my recommendation would be to allow for flexibility in our policy so that as there is turnover in these positions, we are able to have the flexibility we need to adjust and offer something above potentially just the 10%. So that would be my recommendation. And the second thing I heard that I really would like to associate my views on this with is from Trustee Morales, which is this idea that we've gone through enormous lengths to gather additional information for this one category. I think that we should be doing this across the board. That if we're looking at major adjustments in one category, we should, and whether or not people are being compensated fairly, we should be using a similar methodology to look at all of our employees. Because in any healthy organization, considering compensation across the spectrum is really important. And what I hear a lot about when I visit the campuses are about employees who we have who are really struggling to be able to take care of their families on the salaries, and the kinds of discrepancies in hiring practices and compensation that are really concerning to me. But I have yet, in my 7 months of being on this board, seen a comprehensive study about some of the issues that are being raised, again, with members of our staff who are not being paid in the six-figure salaries. So I would just suggest that moving forward, we do two things. One is allow ourselves flexibility on a case-by-case basis rather than changing the policy across the board for presidential salaries. And then secondly, we look at how we would approach gathering additional information as we have for president's compensation for employees across the board, so that we can actually see, okay, if we have, again, according to this particular study, and again, I think the apples to apples is very, very difficult, maybe even impossible, but very difficult at least, but that we are also at least trying to understand how we are compensating employees across the spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you. The Chancellor would like to respond to that.
Thank you, Governor. Excellent points. I'm going to ask Andy to articulate what we do in public and what we do in private in just a moment. But I do want to make it very clear that this is the board holds a responsibility for the salaries of 30 employees, and everything else is delegated to me and through me to other levels of authority. We'll report everything on an annual basis for the vice presidents and things of that nature. So to Doug, I appreciate your comment about the transparency, because we really are interested in doing that. This is not an easy conversation to do in public, simply because we have 23 presidents sitting here going, oh my,
Right.
which red dot am I? But I want to be very, very clear that I've not talked to the presidents about this by design. I wanted to insulate and inoculate them, because they're the people we're talking about, their salaries. This is intentionally occurring at the board level. And as Andy will explain in just a moment under Bagley-Keene, that we actually talk policy in the public arena, but we'll actually talk executive compensation about individuals, to your point, Lieutenant Governor, in closed session, and then report any actions that board takes in closed session back to the public at large. Andy, could you kind of go back through the Bagley-Keene piece here?
Well, Chancellor, I think you summarized it just perfectly. We have a specific statute under the Ed Code that governs how the CSU sets executive compensation, and it says exactly that policy questions about an overarching policy that applies to all executives, any discussion as well as action on a policy must take place in open session. But if the discussion is regarding an adjustment or a change to an individual executive, those initial conversations are permitted to take place in closed session, but any action to actually approve that change must be voted on and discussed or voted on in public session.
So might need a little bit of help understanding how that's relevant to my comments. What I'm asking for is information to inform the policy. And the information that I'd like to have to inform a policy as to whether or not we should have a blanket increase in presidential salaries is what is the discrepancy between what we are paying our people in the other categories. Because for a healthy institution, they should be in balance. So that's number one. And number two, I think that actually reinforces my argument that we should have flexibility in making determinations on a case-by-case basis rather than a policy that would be a one-size-fits-all policy for presidential compensation. Because if we only have the responsibility of 40 salary packages, surely we have the capacity to talk about them in closed session one at a time, rather than I think the argument was made that if we set this policy, we won't have to take them one at a time. I think we have the capacity to do that, not in public session, but nevertheless to be able to take them one at a time.
All right. I have left on my list, we can add, I have, next is Trustee Abrego, then Trustee Rendon, and then Trustee Furstenberg. Trustee Abrego. Trustee Abrego has passed, so that leaves you, Speaker.
Thank you. I'm at the tail end of a cold. Let me see if I can get through this without coughing. Thank you. But first of all, as someone who ran a number of nonprofit organizations, I often utilized salary studies and salary surveys. So I'm eager to dig into some of the methodology and look at the data there. The summary that I'm getting thus far is that it points to a need for additional compensation for our fine and talented and devoted presidents. I understand that. That being said, there's a tremendous amount of need throughout the Cal States. There's a tremendous amount of need on the part of students to get relief from tuition. There's a tremendous amount of need on the part of faculty and staff to make sure that they get the wages that they deserve. In fact, if my memory serves me correctly, there's a piece of legislation that one of my colleagues, Shirley Weber, that passed out of our House, which calls for the restoration of merit increases for the lowest paid, some of the lowest paid Cal State employees. And this system opposed that piece of legislation on the basis that they felt that they couldn't necessarily afford to make those adjustments. There's a tremendous amount of need to make sure that our collective bargaining units are negotiated with fairly. So there's need throughout the Cal State system. With respect to Trustee Fagan's good question about how this would be received within the legislature, not well at all. I came here, I know we're a little bit behind on our agenda, which is understandable. I came here principally for the discussions about the audit and the discussions about the education bond. And what's ironic about being here for this conversation, perhaps not ironic, but I think there's a link between these issues. When we talk about the audit and the state auditor's recommendations, that's about public trust and about public confidence in this system. When we talked last week on the floor of the Assembly about adopting a education bond, I'll be perfectly honest with you, and this is not betraying any confidences. We don't go into these discussions about education bonds haphazardly. We do polling. We do significant polling data. Community colleges poll very well. K through 12 polls very well. This system and the UC system do not poll very well at all for a number of reasons. So the education bond that is before, that will be likely be before the voters is an education bond that starts essentially with preschool and goes all the way through the Cal States and the UCs. And quite honestly, if it passes, I think it'll pass and probably end up helping this institution to the tune of $2 billion. I believe, based on the data that we looked at, based on the data that we mulled over, I believe that it'll pass because of the fact that it has K through 12 and preschool on it, and community colleges, not because it has the Cal State or the UC systems. So I appreciate this discussion, and I certainly appreciate Trustee Fagan's political considerations about how this would be received at the legislative on behalf of by the legislature. We should also think about how this would be received by the public in general as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have Trustee Furstenberg, who's been very patient.
Lucky me. I've been at this table for 3.5 years. And I think I think it's as anyone who knows me knows that I think this is an incredible institution. But to your point, we have not told our story well. And I have said that from day one. And how many alumni do we have out there? How many hundreds of thousands of alumni? Millions of alumni. We have to do a better job. We really have to do a better job. What we also have to do it's not an ideal world, it's not a real world, but it needs to be a fair world. And I support what Adam said and what the Speaker and the Lieutenant Governor said. I believe that this is a remarkable institution because everyone associated with this institution is responsible for that. The staff, the faculty, the administration, and the presidents. I have never been to a campus where it didn't look like the people who were there cared. We have new buildings, we have old buildings. But you can tell that the people who are on those campuses are committed to those campuses, take care of those campuses. So we're all in this together. We are all in this together. But what has happened in the last 7 years under the leadership of this chancellor, from what I can gather historically, is that he has changed. He has changed who we are and what we are because of the people he has put up there. We are different now. And those 23 people have made a commitment to almost 480 students that they are the only important thing that they think about, and they never stop thinking about them. And the only way we can keep the character and quality, integrity, and commitment of 23 people in those chairs is to be fair to them. And we have to find a way to set a policy. And there are lots of excellent ideas about what that policy might be. But we have to move in the direction that finds a policy that works so that we can keep the character of this institution at the standard that that gentleman has set for us. He wants us to be an inclusive, compassionate California State University. And that's what we have to be. And the only way we can do that is if we work toward a fair policy to compensate all of you and all of us together. That's all I got.
Thank you. Yes, we have Trustee Morales.
I just want to add that I think we should consider what the speaker just said about the polling. And also, the chancellor spoke in Fresno last week about the connection between K through 12 and the community colleges and UC and the CSU. So I think it's in our interest to take initiatives like in this bond to be tied with the system, because we're all one. From my vantage point, I mean, it's all connected. So I just hope we continue to communicate to the citizenry of the state that we're all working together, and we should be.
All right. Well, I believe. Yes, Trustee Carney.
Sorry, I'm jumping in later. I really agree with what Trustee Furstenberg said. I think we have to find a way to treat our presidents fairly. And I hope that when the report comes back as an action item, when this comes back as an action item, we will have a series of choices so that we could address inequities as a part of 3- and 6-year performance reviews for presidents, or we could do an across-the-board adjustment for presidents that are below the median or below 15% below the median, whichever, so that we have a choice of options here. But I think it's very important to not, because this is such a difficult decision, because it's so politically fraught, we delay. And every time we delay, the unfairness increases. Right. And so, for me, item number 1 is to not delay. We need to do something here. We need to change this policy. We need to address this and not just, delay for another day, which it's never easier. It's the same political difficulty, no matter what month we take it up, no matter what year we take it up. So I think we just need to do this. Thank you.
All right. So I believe, Chairman Day, this concludes the business of the Committee on University. Okay.
Much of what I wanted to say was stated by Ms. Furstenberg, and I thought that was an excellent summation of my feelings. I too, since my first day here, have tried to have believed in the equitable obligation of people to be treated equitably, fairly, and in recognition of the huge responsibility vested in them. The problem with that is that yesterday was my first day, so I have some very elemental questions to ask if you have the time to deal with them. I would, though, like to also say that I believe that part of, consistent again with what was said, and that I've been pervasive in stating that, is while I understand that the perception sometimes is that public relations, advertising, that type of publicizing of facilities is viewed as may be viewed, at least on a short-term basis, as a waste of a ineffective use of resources, given the many and innumerable important pockets that are competing for available dollars. I nonetheless think raising the identity of CSU and the pride that it should have in the teachers, the professors, the job that it's done, and being able to publicize it to the point of gaining public acceptance presumptively on what they choose to do is a major undertaking, but nonetheless a valid undertaking. With that said, as a prelude, I just had a couple of questions because I always, as I say, I've had, and I apologize beforehand because they're very elemental, the questions. Total remuneration, and I direct this at the gentleman who submitted the report, included incentives. And I'm sure it's defined someplace, but what incentives are we talking about that are normally and usually or even exceptionally provided in either the CSU system or in the comparative systems or universities we were looking at?
Yeah, well, I'll speak to the outside world in terms of what incentives are offered out there. So if we distinguish base salaries, which pay for KSAs, we call them, knowledge, skills, and abilities, think of base salary paying for that. Incentives pay for above and beyond. So above and beyond the normal job and for achieving certain goals. It could be for, we are going to open up a new building or a new curriculum on campus within the next year. Somebody's going to be responsible for it. And if they do that, there would be some bonus tied to that. For example, that a president might be able to earn above and beyond their normal base salary. So that would be an example of extra remuneration in the form of an incentive pay, variable dollars. And those dollars are only available, A, if there's budgeting for it, and B, and if the goal is achieved, right? And there may be even a scale of achievement that says, somewhat achieved and, exceeded. So, and those dollar amounts could move depending on how well they achieved against that goal. So that would be another form of pay that would allow for the total package. If this year we're looking at total remuneration, that would allow the pay package to become more competitive.
And does that incentive or anything comparable exist in the CSU system in which there are benchmarks to be accomplished, and upon their accomplishment, it will be recognized by an increase in salary?
Yeah, I'll let Chancellor White speak to that as far as current practice goes with the president, because I'm not.
Were there any in your report, I should say?
No, base pay is what was reported because we do not provide incentives to our presidents.
It may be prohibited, I don't know, but it's an answer to the question, and I appreciate that. The same question is, if you have a moment to respond to, is the retirement issue. Those are included, but are they included as base salary, or is it included as part of total remuneration?
It's part of the total remuneration. So if you look at retirement programs in the country, there's two kinds. There's the formula-driven, kind of pre-PEPRA style plan, where based on years of service and attainment of points, you receive a certain payout. And then there's other types of plans that are called cash balance plans that an institution would just simply put dollars in every year. So let's say they put in $50,000 a year every year for the retirement program, and it just adds up over time. So anything like that, whether it's kind of the older style defined benefit or the newer style cash balance, those dollars that got allocated, that would be considered in the total remuneration, but not in the base salary. And then we get our information mostly from something called the Form 990, which is a publicly available record that will tell us by individual at peer institutions what exactly they received. So it's a very precise kind of information.
So are retirement benefits included in total remuneration for the CSU system?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And again, I apologize. I know you have reams of documentation that I just haven't had a chance to go through.
All right, now I think I can say, Chairman Day, this concludes the business of the Committee on University and Faculty Personnel.
Thank you, Trustee Farrar.